Well, I want to make a claim at the start of this episode that I think is going to sound kind of strange coming from a Christian channel. Here it is. Most people who grew up in church have never actually met Jesus. Now, I don't mean they've never heard of him. Obviously, they have. I don't mean they've never sat through a sermon about him or sung songs about him or prayed to him. I mean the actual Jesus, the one in the Gospels, the one who said things that made crowds walk away, the one who picked fights with the most religiously powerful people in his culture and won, the one who made a claim about himself so bold, so specific, so unimaginable that you literally cannot be neutral about it once you really hear it. That Jesus. That's who I'm talking about. Because somewhere along the way, a lot of churches have handed a lot of us a substitute Jesus, a safer version, a more manageable version. A Jesus who basically agrees with whoever's preaching, never says anything hard enough to cost you anything, and fits neatly inside a 90-minute Sunday morning service. And I think for a lot of people who have walked away from the faith, or those sitting in a pew feeling vaguely unsatisfied, or who've always suspected there was more to this than what they were handed, I think the Jesus they walked away from wasn't the real one. So, for today, that's who we're going to meet. No stained glass, no sanitized Sunday school version, just the Gospels opened up and the actual person at the center of the whole thing. And by the end of this, I think you're going to understand why he would get escorted out of most churches today. You ready to dig in? Let's go. Okay, before we get to the real Jesus, I want to name some of the substitutes, because I think there are a lot of us who have encountered at least one of these and maybe didn't even realize it at the time. So, the first substitute is therapist Jesus. This is the Jesus who exists primarily to help you feel better about yourself. You'll find him in a certain kind of church where every sermon is essentially about your potential, your healing, your breakthrough. Jesus loves you unconditionally, and what that means in practice is that he's never going to say anything that makes you uncomfortable. He's warm. He's affirming. He's basically the world's best life coach, but with a halo. Now look, the love of Jesus is real. The compassion of Jesus is real, and I'm not at all dismissing that. But the therapist Jesus is missing something really important. The actual Jesus said things like, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. That's not life coaching language. That's the language of someone calling you to do something that's going to cost you something. Therapist Jesus never asks for anything hard. The real Jesus asked people to leave everything they had and follow him, and some did. And some of them walked away sad. The second substitute is political Jesus. Now, before I go into this, I want to be clear that this one shows up on both sides of the aisle, okay? There's the Jesus who is essentially a conservative Republican. He's pro-America, pro-traditional values, and his priorities map almost perfectly onto a certain political platform. And then there's the Jesus who essentially is a progressive activist. He's all about social justice. He's basically a socialist, and his priorities map almost perfectly onto a different political platform. Both of these Jesuses are remarkably convenient for whoever's preaching them. And both of them should make us suspicious. Because the actual Jesus, the one in the Gospels here, managed to confuse and frustrate everyone. The religious conservatives of his day thought he was dangerously liberal. The political revolutionaries of his day thought he wasn't radical enough. And then the Romans, they thought he was a threat. His own family thought he'd lost his mind at one point. A Jesus that everyone on your side of the political aisle is comfortable with is probably not the real one. Okay, the third substitute is Mascot Jesus. This is the Jesus who who gets invoked but never actually consulted. He shows up at the beginning and the end of things, a prayer to open the meeting, a blessing to close the dinner. His name is on the building, his cross is on the wall, but when the actual decisions get made about money and power, about who gets included and who gets pushed out, nobody's actually asking what he would do. He's the team mascot. He represents the brand, but he's not really running everything. The actual Jesus was not interested in being anyone's mascot. He said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say?" He told a story about people who did religious things in his name, prophecy, miracles, ministry. And he said to them, "I never knew you." He's not interested in the association. He's interested in the relationship. And those things are very different. So we have three substitutes: therapist Jesus, political Jesus, and mascot Jesus. All of them have just enough truth in them to be convincing, but all of them are missing something really essential. And I think a lot of the reason that people are walking away from the faith is that they have encountered one of these substitutes, found it hollow, and concluded that Jesus himself was the problem. But what if the substitute was the problem? What if the real one is something entirely different? Well, let's go find out. Well, I want to go to three specific moments in the Gospels. 3 times Jesus said something so hard, so unimaginable, so completely unlike the substitute versions that we just talked about, that the room actually cleared out. And I want you to notice something as we go through these. Jesus doesn't chase the people who leave. He doesn't soften the message to win them back. He doesn't call a meeting afterwards to figure out how to make teaching more accessible. He just lets them go. Now, that is not how a therapist Jesus operates, and that's not how a mascot Jesus operates. That's how someone operates who is more committed to truth than to crowd size. So, moment number 1. John chapter 6. Jesus had just fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It's the most spectacular thing anyone in that crowd had ever seen. And now they're following him in boats around the lake, tracking him down the next day. And Jesus, instead of capitalizing on the momentum, instead of launching a ministry campaign, he says something that stops everyone cold. He says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never grow hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." But then he goes further. Listen, he says, "Very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." Now, he's speaking metaphorically about faith and total dependence on him, but the crowd doesn't get it. And honestly, it's hard language even when you do get it. Here's what happened next. And this is the part that really gets me every time I read it. John 6:66, that verse number alone is almost too much on the nose. It says, "From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him." Not the Pharisees, not the skeptics, his disciples. The people who had been following him, who watched the miracles, who had actually eaten the bread from the 5 loaves and 2 fish. They left. Jesus turns to the 12, his inner circle, and says, "Do you not want to leave too?" That's not the question of someone who's managing his audience. That's not therapist Jesus or mascot Jesus. That's someone who just watched most of his following walk out the door and basically saying, "If you want to go, you can go too." Peter answers the group, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And that's it. No damage control. No revised messaging strategy. The crowd thins and Jesus just keeps on going. Moment 2. Luke chapter 14. Jesus is at dinner, which if you have read the Gospels, you know that a surprising amount of important stuff happens at dinners. And he turns to the crowd that's following him and he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sister, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Now, I need to pause here because I know what that sounds like. And I know that therapist Jesus would never say that. So what's happening here, I learned this from my Bible college days. Jesus is using a Semitic rhetorical device. It's an extreme contrast language to make a point about a priority. He's not literally telling you to hate your family. He's saying, if it ever comes down to a choice between me and anything else, I have to be first. Not second, not tied for first. And then, in case anyone missed it, he says this, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything, you cannot be my disciples. Give up everything. Not consider giving up some things, not make Jesus a significant priority in your overall life management strategy. No, Jesus said everything. You know, that word has a way of making a crowd really uncomfortable. And I think it was supposed to. Okay, moment number 3. John chapter 8. Okay, Jesus is in the temple court, and he's teaching. And he says something to the Jewish religious leaders that is so provocative, so specifically designed to provoke them, that by the end of the conversations, they pick up stones to kill him. He's been talking about Abraham, who is the founding father of the Jewish faith, the most revered figure in their entire religious history. And the leaders are invoking Abraham as their authority. They say, we are Abraham's descendants. And Jesus said, very truly, I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, if you know your Old Testament, you know exactly what he just did. I am is the name God gives himself when Moses asked who he is at the burning bush. Exodus 3:14 says, I am who I am. It is the divine name, the holiest name in the entire Jewish tradition. Jesus just applied it to himself in the temple, to the faces of the religious leaders. And they pick up stones because they understood exactly what he was claiming. They didn't think he was confused or speaking loosely. They thought he was blaspheming because the claim was absolutely clear. He wasn't saying he was a great teacher. He wasn't saying he had a special connection with God. He was saying he was God. And that specific claim is what we need to talk about now. Before we get to the claim itself, I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think gets overlooked. Because when you're figuring out who someone really is, you don't just listen to what they say, you watch what they do and who they spend time with. I love this. I really love this. And when you look at who Jesus spent time with in the Gospels, the picture that you get is not a picture most churches paint. He ate with tax collectors. So in the first century, we talked about this with Zacchaeus. The first century Jewish world, tax collectors weren't just unpopular, they were traitors. They worked for the Roman government. They overcharged their own people with taxes and pocketed the difference. They were the most despised category of person in that society. Jesus did not avoid them. He went to their houses. He ate at their tables. He called one of them, Matthew, to be one of his 12 closest disciples. He talked to women alone in public, which was a significant social violation in that culture. The woman at the well, Mary and Martha, the woman who anointed his feet. The women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, in a culture where a woman's testimony wasn't even admissible in court. Jesus didn't seem to care about any of that. He touched lepers. In a world where leprosy meant total social exclusion, where the law required lepers to shout out, "Unclean!" so people could avoid them, Jesus reached out and he touched them. He didn't have to. He could have healed them with one word. He touched them. He spent time with Samaritans, Romans, Gentiles, all the people that the religious establishment of his day considered outside of the boundaries of God's favor. And here's the thing I want you to sit with. The religious leaders of his day, the people who were supposed to be the experts on God, they used all of this against him. They called him a friend of sinners like it was an insult. Jesus just kept going. He just kept doing it. Because for Jesus, the people that the religious system had written off weren't the problem. They were the point. Look, if you've ever felt like the church put you outside of the boundaries, like you were the wrong kind of person, asking the wrong kind of questions, carrying the wrong kind of history, the Jesus of the Gospels walked toward people like you, not to leave you where you were. Okay, we've talked about what Jesus said. We've talked about who he spent time with. Now I need to talk to you about his claim. Because you can appreciate Jesus as a teacher. You can admire his ethics. You can think the Sermon on the Mount is beautiful and the way he treated people was remarkable. And you can still miss the point. Because Jesus didn't primarily present himself as a teacher with helpful ideas. He presented himself as the answer to the most fundamental human problem, which is separation from God. In John 14:6, Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Not a way, not one option among many, the way, the only way. Now, I know that sounds exclusive, and in our current culture moment, our society, exclusive claims make people really uncomfortable. But I want to ask you to sit with the logic of it just for a second. Okay, if God is real, if there's a creator, a ground of all being, a source of all meaning and love and truth, then the question of how human beings relate to that God is not a small question. It's the question. Everything else is just downstream of it. And Jesus, this carpenter from Nazareth, who had no political power, he had no army, no institutional backing, he stood up and said, "I am the answer to that question. I am the way back. I am the door." C.S. Lewis, and I know I've quoted him a couple of times in this series, but he's worth quoting again. I love this quote. He made an argument about this that I think really just cuts through all of the confusion and the fog. He said there are basically three options when it comes to Jesus making this kind of claim of being the Son of God. Number one, he was a liar. He knew he wasn't what he said he was, and he said it anyway. Number two, he was a lunatic. He genuinely believed it, but he was delusional. The kind of person who, if you met them today, you'd be concerned about. Or three, he was telling the truth. He was Lord. Liar, lunatic, or Lord. Lewis's point, and it's a good one, is that the one option that it's actually not on the table is a nice moral teacher who had some great ideas. Because nice moral teachers don't claim to be the eternal I am. They don't say nobody gets to God except through them. A person who says those things is either telling the truth or they're not someone you describe as nice at all. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you have to conclude that he's Lord. That's a decision you have to make for yourself. But I am going to tell you that you can't stay neutral. You can't just admire Jesus from a comfortable distance and call it a day. He didn't leave that option open. The claims are way too specific, way too bold, honestly, too strange to just shrug off. He's either the most important person in human history, or he was deeply confused about who he was. And I think the weight of evidence, the life, the teaching, the death, and the resurrection, that either happened or is the most elaborate and unexplainable hoax in all of human history. I think it points in one direction. But you have to look at it yourself. You have to go to the Gospels and actually meet him, not the substitute, the real one. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this series. We talked about Pride Month and how Jesus engaged with the people that the religious establishment had written off. We talked about hell and what it actually means for a loving God to take human choices seriously. And now we're here, face to face with the person at the center of it all. And I want to ask you a direct question, not to make you uncomfortable, just because I think it's the only question that actually matters after everything we've talked about. What do you do with him? Not with the church, not with religion, not with the theology or the doctrine or the institution. What do you do with him? Because the thing I keep coming back to, the people who walked away from Jesus in John 6 after the hard teaching, when the crowd thinned out, they walked away from Jesus himself, not from a bad version of him, from Jesus. And he let them go. But Peter stayed. And when Jesus asked him why, where would we go? I think that's one of the most honest answers in the entire New Testament, because it's not, I've got everything figured out. It's not, I never doubt. It's, we've looked around. There's nothing else like this. There's nobody else saying what you're saying. So we're staying. That is not polished faith. That's real faith. And I think if you've made it through these 3 episodes on my channel here, something in you is asking the same question that Peter was asking. Not, is the church worth going to? Not, do I agree with all of the Christian doctrines? Just, who is this person? And what do I do with him? I think the most honest thing I can tell you is go find out for yourself. Not through this channel, not through any preacher or podcast or YouTube video. Open the Gospel of John and read it like someone who doesn't already know what it's supposed to say. Read it like you're meeting someone for the first time and see what you find. Because I think what you'll find, if you go looking with an honest heart, is not the safe, domesticated, manageable version that the church has sometimes handed out. You're going to find someone who walked toward people everyone else walked away from, who said things nobody else had the courage or the audacity to say, who made a claim about himself that the whole world is still trying to reckon 2,000 years later, and who at the end of the day just keeps asking the same question he asked Peter. What about you? Who do you say that I am? Friends, that's the only question that matters, and it's one that only you can answer. Well, that's our 3-episode series, Pride Month, Hell and Judgment, and today, the real Jesus. If any of these struck a chord in you with something real, would you share it? Not to argue with anyone, just because there are people in your life sitting with the same questions and not knowing where to look. And also, if you want to keep this going, If you want more of this biblical truth without the religious games, the hard questions opened honestly, hit subscribe. There's a lot more coming. I'm excited. Well, this is Truth Behind the Mic. I'm Mike Stone, and I hope to see you next time.